Today, we are diving into a real-life scientific detective story. For centuries, a deadly disease called malaria plagued humanity, and nobody knew how it spread. We're going to see how biologists used a step-by-step playbook, the biological method, to finally crack this life-or-death case.
So, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the initial mystery, the malaria puzzle. Then, we'll zero in on the main suspect with a solid hypothesis. We'll check out the risky human experiment that proved it, map out the cycle of infection, and see how the method was confirmed. And finally, a quick field guide to know your mosquitoes. Let's get into it.
You have to understand, for literally hundreds of years, malaria was this terrifying, lethal mystery. People saw its devastating effects firsthand, but they had absolutely no clue how it was transmitted. And figuring this out wasn't just some intellectual exercise, it was a race against time to save millions of lives.
Which brings us to the central question, right? How on earth did science go from complete darkness, from total confusion, to having a clear answer? How did they finally crack the code?
Well, every great investigation needs a lead. And in science, that lead is often a hypothesis, which is really just a testable, educated guess. The first thing biologists had to do was identify a prime suspect for spreading this disease. And here it is, the big idea. The hypothesis was actually pretty simple. Mosquitoes are transmitting a tiny parasite called Plasmodium, and that's what causes malaria. So think about it. The mosquito isn't the killer itself. It's more like the getaway driver for the real culprit.
Now this is where it gets really clever. This if-then statement is called a deduction. It's what takes a guess and turns it into something you can actually test in the real world. The logic is just perfect, isn't it? If the mosquitoes are the carriers, then you've got to be able to find the evidence, the parasite itself inside their bodies.
Okay, so they had a suspect and a testable prediction. It was time for the main event, a bold, frankly dangerous experiment to catch the culprit in the act. This was basically a scientific sting operation. And we can pinpoint this to a single year, 1898. A team of Italian biologists set up the ultimate test. This was incredibly risky. They used human volunteers, but they knew it was the only way to prove their theory beyond a shadow of a doubt.
So here's exactly how it went down. First, they got a specific kind of mosquito, an Anopheles, and let it bite a patient who already had malaria. Step 2, they took that very same mosquito, now carrying the parasite, and let it bite a healthy volunteer. And the result? The healthy person got sick with malaria. That's the smoking gun right there. So, they proved it. The mosquito was the transmitter. Case closed? Well, not quite. That just opened up another question. How exactly does this whole thing work? They needed to understand the full cycle, the culprit's entire method of operation. And before we jump into that, here's a key piece of terminology for you. In this story, the mosquito is what's known as a vector. It's basically any organism that carries a disease from one host to another, often without getting sick itself. It's the middleman. And this lays out the whole sinister process. First, an Anopheles mosquito bites someone with malaria and sucks up blood filled with the Plasmodium parasite. Then, inside the mosquito, that parasite just multiplies like crazy, turning the mosquito into a tiny little disease factory. And finally, when that mosquito bites a healthy person, it injects those parasites into their bloodstream. The cycle starts all over again.
So now, let's just take a step back and appreciate the big picture. This incredible breakthrough didn't just happen by chance. It was the direct result of that structured, investigative process. The experiment delivered the final knockout piece of evidence. The case was now officially closed.
And the conclusion was just undeniable. There was no more debate, no more doubt. It was confirmed mosquitoes transmit Plasmodium. It sounds like such a simple sentence, but that confirmation changed the course of public health forever.
This right here is the playbook they followed. It all started with a problem. People were getting malaria. Then came observation, noticing things, like how the disease seemed to cluster around swamps where mosquitoes breed. That led to the hypothesis, the guess, that mosquitoes were involved. From there, the deduction. If they are, the parasite must be inside them. That led to the experiment we saw, and finally, the results perfectly matched the hypothesis.
This last part is so important. Once you prove something this big, you don't just keep it to yourself. Reporting these results to the world meant that for the first time, we actually had a chance to fight back against malaria effectively. All right, just one last critical piece of intelligence from this investigation. It turns out, not all mosquitoes are guilty. If you want to fight a disease, you have to know exactly which vector you're dealing with. So let's check out the culprit lineup. And being able to tell these two apart is absolutely vital. You've got the Anopheles mosquito, our malaria carrier. But then you have the Aedes mosquito. It might look similar, but it's a vector for totally different things, like the viruses that cause dengue fever. Knowing your enemy really is half the battle.
So there you have it. We've seen how the biological method isn't just a boring checklist. It's a powerful map that can guide us from a total mystery to a life-saving truth. It really makes you think, doesn't it? If this method can solve the puzzle of malaria, what other great challenge should we point at it next?